Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the choices in some of my favorite games and figure out which decision is the right one. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and in this episode, we're diving back into TellTale Games' The Walking Dead Season 1, this time getting into Episode 4. In case you missed the previous episodes, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down the series, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Episode 4 is titled Around Every Corner, and we open on the deserted streets of Savannah, Georgia. Lee, Clementine, Ben, and Kenny are joined by newcomers to the group, Christa, Omid, and Chuck, as they traverse the city on their way to the docks in hopes of finding a boat. Clementine's walkie-talkie is secured to Lee's belt, following the mysterious voice that poured through it at the end of the last episode, and it's clear she's anxious to get it back. Omid is suffering a lot of pain in his leg, having broken it trying to jump on the train, and the group is contemplating whether to stop or not when a church bell above rings out. Lee briefly spots someone fleeing the bell tower before the voice of a man once again echoes from the radio.
If I were you, I'd get out of the street now.
Before the group can figure out what's going on, Chuck utters what might be my favorite line in the series.
Ask not for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee.
The John Donne reference is calling out a horde of zombies brought to the area by the bell, and the group goes into panic mode. After a brief scuffle where Lee saves Kenny's life and Chuck saves everyone by distracting the horde, the majority of them make it into the backyard of one of the houses. The only one left out is Chuck, and his fate will remain a mystery for a bit. There's some question about who is ringing the bell and who was on the radio, as Lee and Kenny hadn't told anyone it was working again, but all of that has to wait as Omid has reopened the wound in his leg. They need to get inside quick, but the house is locked up tighter than Fort Knox. Looking around reveals a locked doggy door that is only useful after digging up the dog that it was likely installed for, and it isn't long before everyone is inside. Lee investigates the downstairs while Kenny and Ben go up, and Ben's frantic voice as Lee finishes checking the last closet brings us into the attic, where Kenny is facing down the memory of his son in the form of a child zombie. And this is the first real choice to be made in the episode, as you can either have Kenny end the boy's suffering or do it yourself. In a world where therapy and psychologists are in short supply, this might be the closest thing that Kenny can have to some kind of closure. He feels like he let Duck down. He blames himself for his son being bitten, and he thinks he's a failure for not having the strength to shoot him before he turned. Logically speaking, Kenny wasn't at fault for what happened, and he isn't weak for being unable to shoot his own flesh and blood. But logic has a funny way of hiding when you need it the most. Having Kenny shoot the boy in the attic and put him out of his misery is the first step in what will be a long healing process. Lee goes into the backyard to bury the child, and this is where we get the first glimpse of the stranger. The dark figure of a man can be seen standing at the fence near the back of the property, and as Lee runs over to confront him, the man takes off. The possible threat renews Kenny's drive to get a boat, and he and Lee decide to head down to the docks before they lose too much more daylight. And it's here where I want to talk a little about this plan of Kenny's. For starters, he wouldn't be the only one with the idea of getting a boat. There's a lot of people out there who think that getting into the water would be the best way to avoid being eaten, but it's not really as great when you start to pick the concept apart. Leaving from Savannah, the group would be heading at least partially into the Atlantic Ocean as they make their way down the coast, presumably to Florida, where Kenny is from. They would need to have a decent supply of food and water on board, as finding places to stop and stock up would be difficult, and they would need plenty of fuel for the journey, as that will be even scarcer along the way. Let's assume they want to get to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Kenny's former home. That trip down the coast would total about 400 miles. Assuming the boat gets around 5 miles per gallon, pretty average fuel economy for a boat, they would need about 80 gallons of fuel just for the trip. There would be a lot of large population centers along the way where they could potentially stop and scavenge, but that would be risky as coming ashore also means coming close to potential hordes that could overtake them. Food might be a little easier, supposing they could use Kenny's experience as a fisherman to catch something to eat, but even then they face the age-old problem that plagued pirates: scurvy. When the human body doesn't get enough vitamin C in it, it has trouble producing collagen, a protein that helps keep your bones, skin, and blood vessels healthy. Vitamin C comes mainly from fruit and veggies, and a diet of mainly fish isn't going to give them what they need to survive in the long run. There's vitamin C supplements that they could take, but that kind of stuff is eventually going to run out. There's also the amount of fresh water that they would need to survive. FEMA recommends that the average person should have 1 gallon of water per day on hand in a survival situation for drinking, food prep, and basic hygiene needs. If we only count Lee, Kenny, Clementine, Omid, Christa, and Ben, that's 6 gallons per day that needs to be accounted for. Getting fresh water isn't going to be easy on the ocean, especially not in the quantities they need to survive. But even with all of that aside, there's still the problem of finding a boat. As Kenny and Lee arrive at the docks, they discover the biggest hurdle they'll have to face 3+ months into the zombie apocalypse. All the boats are gone. There are 1 or 2 of them scattered in the water, partially sunk in the bay or on the shoreline, but there's nothing salvageable in sight, and it turns out there's more than one reason for that. As they're scouting, they come across a wall of zombies, mostly dead, with several live walkers stuck on stakes in the mass. It looks like they just laid down on each other and died. As they're still reeling from that discovery, Lee notices some movement on a nearby bridge as he is peering through the tour viewer in search of any boats in the harbor. The pair hides just in time to see someone come onto the street and go into a nearby newsstand. Trying to sneak up on the person doesn't work, and Lee finds himself taken to the ground and nearly killed before Clementine, who'd followed him despite the fact that Lee told her to stay behind, yells out, begging the person not to kill Lee. The person turns out to be a woman named Molly, and she is the one who's been ringing the bells around the city, including the one from the opening scene. She does it to draw the zombies, which she calls geeks, to one part of the city so she can loot another part of it in relative peace. She also provides the first mention of Crawford, the community behind the Wall of Dead sitting just feet away from them. It's a place where they threw the sick, elderly, and young out in an attempt to make it through the outbreak, while losing as little as possible. As the lack of boats and reality of the situation hits them, a horde of zombies starts closing in, and Lee, Clementine, Kenny, and Molly find themselves trying to escape down an alley. Everyone except Lee manages to get onto a fire escape, and he winds up dropping into the sewers below just in time. And it's down in the sewers where things really open up. First, Lee discovers the fate of Chuck. He'd ended his own life just before being eaten, and a group of zombies can be found munching on what is left of him. Trying to escape near the end of the tunnel, Lee knocks over a board and discovers a hole in the wall behind it that leads into what appears to be an old survivalist bunker stocked with food and supplies. Finding that much food would probably have been great if not for the group of survivors behind the door on the other side of the room. As Lee walks through the door, he is greeted by a look of shock on several faces staring back at him. One of the people in the room pulls a gun on him, and they seem to think he's from Crawford. There's a little back and forth, and you have to be careful with what you say, because the man holding the gun is really shaky, but eventually, Lee manages to calm the situation, and we find out that this is a group of cancer survivors who formerly lived in Crawford and escaped just before the community started to really crack down on the sick and others. The man with the gun, Vernon, is a doctor, and after a short conversation, he agrees to lead you back to the house where your group is staying and even offers to take a look at Omid, who it turns out has taken a turn for the worse. While Vernon's checking on Omid, Lee looks around the house for Clementine, eventually finding her in the shed out back. She was exploring the place while waiting on your return, and she managed to discover a boat that somehow stayed hidden away from the decay of society. Kenny, who seemed to have given up completely following the failure at the waterfront, gets a second wind and is able to determine that the only thing wrong with the vessel is a missing battery and a lack of fuel. The celebration is cut short, however, when the group realizes that the only place around that actually has those things is the mysterious Crawford. Besides the battery and fuel, they also need antibiotics, as Vernon determines Omid is suffering from an infection. After some back and forth, a plan to infiltrate the gated community is hatched, and the group sets off in the dead of night to steal what they need. But Crawford is far from a safe community at this point. As Lee emerges from the sewer tunnel they use to get past the borders, he finds a guard that turns out to be a zombie. And that isn't the only zombie, as the group finds themselves being chased into a school building by a whole group of the dead. At some point, Crawford fell. And that brings us to the supposedly ideal community, where they kick out anyone seen to be more of a drain than a boon on resources. Even someone who isn't actively sick gets thrown out if they are seen as a risk. The goal seems to be building the perfect community, where everyone contributes and pulls their weight. But is something like that really perfect? Would you really want to live in a society that wouldn't hesitate to toss you out at the slightest sign of a physical issue? Let's build a scenario. You're a member of Crawford. You've been there since it started, and you just want to survive what seems to be the end of the world as you know it. You're relatively young, maybe in your 20s or 30s, and as fit and healthy as a person can be. The group's leaders, mainly self appointed people who decided they knew what was best, have passed a rule that anyone who is sick, elderly, or too young to help out around the community needs to be thrown out. This rule doesn't hurt you in any way. You're healthy, you don't have any family that would be impacted, and while some of those being thrown out were friendly with you, at least it's them being tossed out and not you, right? But then the unthinkable happens, and the doctor diagnoses you with cancer, or maybe diabetes. Maybe the illness isn't something that's going to kill you in the short term, but the leaders have decided that letting you stay would be too much of a drain on the resources, and now you find yourself being exiled. And this isn't even a hypothetical situation in the game, it's something that comes to pass. As we work to get the needed supplies, we discover a set of tapes recorded by the medical examiner in Crawford. We get to watch as a woman is told she is pregnant and given the option to either get rid of the baby, which has its own set of risks and complications, or to leave the community. She's devastated, and the end result is that she snaps and kills the doctor, as well as many others, bringing about the downfall of the whole place. That kind of community isn't sustainable because every individual in a given society is vulnerable on their own. Every person is susceptible to disease, injury, physical and mental problems, and trying to build a society excluding those people means building a society where no one can ever feel safe. You have to worry constantly if that little ache you have is just an ache or something more. You have to stress over whether you've done enough to justify your place or if you're going to be tossed out in the next wave. It might be tempting to say that those people are just a drain and that they don't deserve the safety and security of the community when resources are scarce, but it's also important to remember that it could easily be you in that situation. Moving on, the group is able to scrounge up the medicine, battery, and fuel they need just in time to face a horde of zombies brought into the building by Kenny and Bree as they returned with the fuel. The horde had been held at bay by a hatchet Lee stuck in the door, but that lock was removed by Ben as he was looking for something to help open the armory. With the horde of zombies trying to break into the classroom, Kenny starts throwing himself against the armory door, and the rest of the group lets panic seep in. It's in this panic that Ben finally breaks, realizing how his actions have negatively impacted the group, and he blurts out that it's his fault that Duck and Katja are dead. An irate Kenny tries to kill Ben before being stopped by Lee and others, and a vote on what to do with him arises. Kenny reveals that there isn't enough room on the boat they found for everyone, and you have to decide if Ben should be left behind. That vote, however, doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, and within moments, the zombies are breaking in and the group finds themselves fleeing through the open armory door, up a bell tower, and escaping down a ladder on the outside of the tower. Kenny is climbing out, with Lee and Ben being the last to leave, when a zombie, hanging from the now ringing bell in the tower, grabs Ben. You have only a second to react, and shooting the zombie results in both the zombie and Ben falling, with a split-second reaction by Lee being the only thing standing between Ben and death. Ben asks you to let him fall, saying he knows that's the best way to ensure the overall safety of the group, and Kenny encourages you to let go as well. What should you do? As we've moved further into the outbreak and subsequent fall of society, we've seen a big shift in how we look at things morally. Early on, it was more common to use a moral base in line with what we in modern society would expect. By that baseline, saving Ben would be the right choice. While his actions started the series of events that led directly to Katja, Duck, Carly, and Lily dying or being removed from the group, they were themselves not enough to justify his end. Stealing the supplies would be enough to get him locked in jail for a while, or maybe even given community service. But generally speaking, that crime would not be punishable by death in most places. But in this instance, we have to look at Ben from the perspective of the group unity and overall survival. Stealing supplies from the group put others at a great risk, but keeping the information about the bandits from Lee, Kenny, and Lily made that decision even worse. Had they known about the bandits, they could have made a plan to deal with them, or the information might have been what pushed Lily to side with Kenny about leaving the motor inn. That choice also led to the bandits attacking the group, which brought the zombies that wound up biting Duck. Lying by saying he wasn't the one stealing supplies led directly to Carly being killed by Lily, which ultimately led to Lily being exiled from the group. A lot of his decisions can probably be attributed to his age and inexperience, but those decisions have been so hurtful overall that the group might be better off without him. That being said, most of that could probably have been forgotten in the long run if not for his insistence on telling Kenny about the bandits in such a pivotal moment for the group. They were trying to escape what had become an emergency situation, one that Ben once again caused when he removed the axe from the door without asking someone why it was there in the first place, and everyone needed to keep a clear head. By telling Kenny in that moment, he put everything at risk and potentially clouded Kenny's judgment when he needed to be at his best. Had he told Kenny later, or even had Lee help him to do so, he might have been left off of any potential boat or shunned by Kenny, and maybe even the group, but he also might have still been in the group in the long run. And ultimately, that is why the decision to let him fall is the best decision for the group. He can't be trusted to make good decisions when it matters. And when you can't trust someone, it destroys any positive dynamic that could exist. Even if Kenny could forgive him, it wouldn't change the fact that the group in general will now have to wonder if he's going to say something in the wrong moment or decide to do something that hurts everyone again. Let's say he's still there in a month. Maybe even a couple new people have joined the group, and food starts coming up missing. He's going to be the first person everyone looks at as the culprit. Moving past that moment, Lee lets Ben fall and escapes the tower with everyone else. Back at the house, Omid is given antibiotics, and Vernon has some words with Lee regarding Clementine's future. I honestly think Vernon only does this because the writers wanted to misdirect a bit, but he asks Lee if he would consider letting Clementine come and live with them. After refusing that offer, Lee meets with Clementine, who's starting to realize she may never see her parents again. She's been holding out hope, thinking they would be somewhere in Savannah. But as the entire city, including Crawford, seems overrun with the dead, and as the plan to leave on a boat becomes more real, that hope has slipped away. We're left to watch her cry as Lee sits on a couch a few feet away and dozes off. When he wakes, he discovers Clementine is missing again and begins searching for her, finding her hat in the backyard and discovering the walkie laying in the alleyway. As he reaches for the walkie, a zombie attacks, and he has to kill it before picking up the device and noticing a bite on his arm. And now, after all the big decisions to this point, you have a decision that takes the cake. Kenny, Omid, and Christa are walking into the alley, asking Lee what's going on. You can choose to hide the bite or show the group. What do you do? Let's take a second to step back into Season 1 and remember what Herschel told Lee in the barn.
Can I give you a piece of advice?
Sure.
I don't know who you are or what you did. Let's say things don't get better back in the cities, or they get worse before they do. You're going to have to depend on the honesty of strangers if you're going to make it. And if those same people get to questioning yours, you're going to be in trouble. But at least you have the common sense to listen to a man giving you advice.
You have to ask yourself how much you trust this small group, the few people you've got left, to not just abandon you in your worst moment. Choosing to reveal the bite means trusting that Kenny, who crushed a man's skull in without hesitating, who refused to believe his son would turn and then watched his wife take her own life before seeing his son die moments later, will stay by your side. You have to trust that Christa and Omid, who barely know you and have only been around for a couple of days, will stay by your side. You need these people to help you because a bite means that you don't have much time, and you don't even know where to start looking for Clementine. Can you trust that they will help you if they know you might not even make it to wherever she's being held? Have you given them a reason to trust you? Have you been honest with them? Been a good person when it mattered? And that's really what this whole thing is about. Why it's important to be moral and treat others with the respect they deserve, or in some cases that they don't deserve. Just like the situation with Crawford, when things are going your way, it's all good. But when the tables turn and you need a hand up, can you count on it? Whether you wind up by yourself or with a group, you end up in the bunker from earlier, searching for Vernon as Lee is convinced he is the one who took Clementine. Finding the place abandoned, it's only a few moments before you hear Clem's voice crackle through the radio, followed shortly by the voice of the man who's been stalking the group. He tells you to choose your next words carefully, and you have a short time to make a decision before the episode ends. So, who did you wind up bringing along in the search for Clementine? Did you show the bite or not? I want to thank everyone that's shared their opinions and watched this series to this point. I really didn't expect these videos to blow up like they have, and the fact that so many of you have chosen to watch them and leave your thoughts is both incredibly exciting and immensely humbling. We'll be continuing the series each Thursday as we work through each season, and then I'll be moving on to another game to analyze. I've already had a couple of suggestions of games to dive into in the future, and I'm looking for more. So leave your thoughts below, or come on over to Discord and have a chat. I've also got a Patreon for anyone who's interested. I typically share videos over there a bit before they go live here, and I share some Patreon exclusive stuff, including chapters of upcoming books, and a lot more. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.